Mom's sick, so I came instead. The little girl stood in the CEO's office holding a folder. Daniel Morrison laughed. This is ridiculous. Go home, kid. But when she opened her mouth, his laughter died, and his world changed forever. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. The morning sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison Industries' executive suite on the 47th floor, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Daniel Morrison stood at his desk, surveying the city below like a king surveying his kingdom. At 42 years old, he had built an empire worth billions, and he never let anyone forget it. His secretary, Margaret Foster, knocked softly on the heavy door before entering. She had worked for Daniel for 15 years and had learned to read his moods with precision. This morning, he was in one of his impatient moods, the kind where anyone who wasted his time would regret it. "Mr. Morrison, your 9 o'clock interview is here," Margaret announced, her voice carefully neutral. Daniel didn't look up from the documents on his desk. "Send them in. And Margaret, this is the last interview for the assistant position. If this candidate is as incompetent as the others, I'm canceling the search entirely." "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, retreating toward the door. Daniel had been searching for a new executive assistant for weeks. The position required someone who could anticipate his needs, work insane hours without complaint, and essentially have no life outside the office. He paid well, extremely well, but he demanded perfection. The problem was that no one seemed capable of meeting his standards. He had interviewed 23 candidates so far. Some were too slow. Others asked too many questions about work-life balance, a concept Daniel found laughable. One had actually had the audacity to ask about vacation days during the first interview. Daniel had ended that conversation in under 3 minutes. The sound of the door opening made him glance up, prepared to deliver his standard intimidating greeting. But what he saw made him freeze completely. Standing in the doorway was not an adult professional in business attire. Instead, a little girl walked into his office with careful, determined steps. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She clutched a worn leather folder against her chest, and her eyes, large and impossibly serious for a child, scanned the massive office with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Daniel's mouth fell open. For the first time in years, he was completely speechless. The girl walked further into the office, her small shoes making soft sounds against the marble floor. She approached his desk with a solemnity that was both touching and absurd. When she reached the chair across from his desk, she carefully climbed onto it, placing the folder on her lap and looking at him with those unnervingly serious eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said in a voice that was surprisingly clear and steady. "My name is Emma Parker. I'm here for the 9 o'clock interview." Daniel blinked several times, certain he was hallucinating. He looked toward the door, expecting Margaret to rush in and explain this bizarre situation, but the door remained closed. He looked back at the child who sat perfectly still, waiting for his response. What is this?" Daniel finally managed to say, his voice a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Is this some kind of joke? Where are your parents?" "My mom is sick," Emma replied simply, as if this explained everything. "She has the flu and a very high fever. She couldn't come today, so I came instead." Daniel stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. "You came instead of your mother, to a job interview?" "Yes, sir." Emma nodded seriously. "Mom really needs this job. She said this interview was very important and that you don't give second chances. So when she got too sick to get out of bed this morning, I knew I had to come." The absurdity of the situation was so complete that Daniel didn't know whether to laugh or call security. A child had somehow made it past building security, past his secretary, and into his office, claiming to be here for a professional job interview on behalf of her sick mother. "How old are you?" Daniel asked, still trying to make sense of this. "I just turned 7 last month," Emma answered. "And how exactly did you get here? Where do you live?" "We live in Riverside. I took 2 buses. Mom has a bus pass, so I used that. I've watched her take the bus lots of times, so I knew which ones to get on." Daniel felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. Was it concern? A 7-year-old child had navigated the public transportation system alone to get to a job interview. The danger, the recklessness, the sheer impossibility of what she was describing. "Does your mother know you're here?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than intended. Emma's confidence faltered for the first time. She looked down at the folder in her lap. "Not exactly. She was sleeping when I left. She took medicine and it makes her very sleepy. But I left her a note so she wouldn't worry when she wakes up." "A note," Daniel repeated flatly. "You left your sick mother a note and then traveled across the city by yourself. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "I was careful," Emma insisted, looking up at him again. "And Mom needs this job really badly, Mr. Morrison. We got evicted from our old apartment and we're staying with Mom's friend Mrs. Rodriguez right now, but we can't stay there forever. Mom has been looking for work for a long time. When she got the call for this interview, she was so happy. I heard her crying in the bathroom after she hung up. Good crying, not sad crying." Daniel felt that uncomfortable sensation growing stronger. He had never been particularly good with children, had never wanted any of his own, and certainly had never had one sitting in his office explaining their family's housing crisis to him. "Emma," Daniel said, trying to sound firm but not cruel, "I appreciate that your mother needs employment, but this is not how job interviews work. You are 7 years old. You cannot interview for your mother's position. This is absolutely inappropriate." "I know I can't do the job," Emma said quickly. "I'm not trying to pretend I can, but I can tell you about my mom. I can tell you why she'd be perfect for this job, and I can ask if maybe you could give her another chance to interview when she's better." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying this peculiar child who had somehow infiltrated his morning. There was something about her determination, her absolute seriousness that was almost impressive. No, that couldn't be right. This was ridiculous. He should call security right now and have them take her home. "Please, Mr. Morrison," Emma continued, sensing his hesitation. "Just give me 5 minutes. If you still want me to leave after that, I'll go. But my mom is the hardest working person I know. She deserves a chance." Daniel found himself saying something he hadn't expected. 5 minutes. "You have 5 minutes to tell me about your mother. But I'm making no promises." Emma's face lit up with a smile that was so genuine, so filled with hope, that Daniel had to look away. He wasn't used to dealing with such unfiltered emotion. In his world, everyone wore masks, played games, calculated every interaction. This child's transparency was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Emma opened the folder with careful hands. Inside were several documents, a printed resume, what looked like reference letters, and some other papers. "My mom's name is Sarah Parker. She's 31 years old. She used to work as an executive assistant at Thornton Financial for 6 years. Daniel recognized the name. Thornton Financial was a reputable company, though smaller than his own. Why did she leave that position? Emma's expression became sad. The company got bought by a bigger company and they let a lot of people go. Mom said it was called restructuring. She's been looking for work for 8 months now. She's had other interviews, but nothing worked out. 8 months. That was a long time to be unemployed, especially with a child to support. Daniel found himself doing the math in his head. Savings depleted. Unemployment benefits running out. Desperation setting in. He shook off these thoughts. Her employment history was not his concern. "What makes you think your mother would be qualified for this position?" Daniel asked, deciding to treat this bizarre situation with at least minimal professionalism. Emma straightened in her chair. "Mom is super organized. She has a planner where she writes everything down. She never forgets anything. Not birthdays, not appointments, nothing. She always says that being prepared is the most important thing in any job." "Organization is a basic requirement," Daniel said dismissively. "What else?" "She works really hard. At her old job, she was always the first person there and the last person to leave. Her boss, Mr. Thornton, wrote her a reference letter. It's right here." Emma pulled out a document and held it up, though she was too far away for Daniel to read it. Daniel made a note to actually look at the woman's credentials later, though he was fairly certain this interview, if it could be called that, would lead nowhere. "Continue. Mom is also really good with technology. She knows all the computer programs. Excel, Word, PowerPoint, all of them. She even taught herself some coding because she said it might be useful. She's always learning new things." Despite himself, Daniel was mildly impressed. Self-motivated learning was a trait he valued. What about her ability to work under pressure? This position requires someone who can handle high-stress situations without falling apart. Emma nodded vigorously. Mom is super good under pressure. When I got really sick last year and had to go to the hospital, she didn't panic even though I could tell she was scared. She stayed calm and took care of everything. And when we got evicted, she didn't cry until I was asleep. She always keeps it together when things are hard. The image Emma was painting, of a mother struggling to maintain composure while her world fell apart, protecting her daughter from seeing her fear, struck something in Daniel that he didn't want to acknowledge. He cleared his throat. Your 5 minutes are almost up, Emma. Is there anything else you think I should know? Emma looked at him with those serious eyes, and for a moment, Daniel saw something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Disappointment. Not in him specifically, but in the world in general. This child had learned too young that life wasn't fair, that hard work didn't always lead to success, that sometimes good people struggled while others thrived. Mr. Morrison, Emma said quietly, I know you're very important and very busy. I know you probably think this is silly, me being here instead of my mom, but I also know that people like you have the power to change people's lives. You could help my mom. You could give her a chance. People like me? Daniel repeated, his tone sharper than intended. People with money and power, Emma said without any judgment in her voice, simply stating a fact. Mom says that people like you decide things for people like us. She says it's not always fair, but that's how the world works. Daniel felt something twisting in his gut. Was it guilt? Shame? He pushed the feeling away. He had built his empire through hard work and intelligence. He didn't owe anyone anything. Emma, I'm going to be honest with you, Daniel said, standing up from his chair and walking around his desk. Your mother may be qualified. She may be hardworking and organized and good with technology. But what you've done today, skipping school, traveling across the city alone, showing up to a professional interview on her behalf, this shows poor judgment. It shows that your family doesn't understand professional boundaries. He watched the hope drain from Emma's face, and he hated himself for it, even as he continued speaking. I cannot hire someone whose 7-year-old child thinks it's acceptable to take their place at a job interview. It reflects badly on your mother's parenting and her professional judgment. I'm sorry, but the answer is no. Emma slid down from the chair, clutching the folder to her chest. She didn't cry, which Daniel found even worse than if she had. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting his rejection with a dignity that seemed impossible for someone so young. I understand, Mr. Morrison, Emma said softly. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry I wasted it. She turned toward the door, and Daniel felt something breaking inside his chest. He told himself it was just indigestion from his breakfast meeting. It couldn't be his conscience. He had stopped listening to that particular voice years ago. Wait, Daniel heard himself say, the word escaping before he could stop it. Emma turned back, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. Daniel had no idea what he was about to say. He only knew that watching this child walk out of his office, defeated, carrying the weight of her mother's hopes on her small shoulders, felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. How do you plan to get home? He asked, his voice gentler than before. The bus, sir. Same way I came. Daniel checked his watch. It's 9:30. Shouldn't you be in school? I told my teacher I had a family emergency, Emma said. Mom always says honesty is important, but she also says that sometimes you have to do what you have to do. Daniel made a decision that surprised him. He picked up his phone and called Margaret. Margaret, come to my office, please, and cancel my 10 o'clock meeting. He looked at Emma, who stood by the door looking confused and hopeful and scared all at once. You're not taking the bus home alone, Daniel said firmly. I'm having my driver take you, and we're calling your mother first to let her know where you are. She's probably worried sick. But the interview? Emma asked. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. He was going to regret this. He could feel it in his bones. But something about this strange morning had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't ignore. Tell your mother to call my office when she's recovered. I'll schedule another interview. Emma's face transformed with a smile so bright it was almost painful to look at. Really? You really mean it? I mean it, Daniel said, though he was already questioning his sanity. But Emma, you cannot do things like this again. What you did was dangerous. Your mother is going to be very upset when she finds out. She's going to be mad, Emma agreed, but maybe less mad if I tell her you're giving her another chance. Despite everything, Daniel found himself almost smiling. Perhaps. Now, let's call her. As Margaret entered and Daniel explained the situation, leaving out his initial harsh rejection, he watched Emma clutch that folder like it contained the most precious treasure in the world. In a way, he supposed it did. It contained her mother's future, her family's hope, their chance at stability, and somehow, impossibly, this 7-year-old child had made him care. The phone call to Sarah Parker was one of the most uncomfortable conversations Daniel Morrison had ever had in his professional life. Margaret had found the contact number on the resume Emma had brought, and Daniel found himself staring at his phone, wondering how to explain to a sick, desperate mother that her 7-year-old daughter had traveled across the city alone to attend a job interview on her behalf. "I'll make the call," Margaret offered, sensing his hesitation. "This might be easier coming from another woman." Daniel nodded gratefully and put the phone on speaker so Emma could hear. The child sat in the chair across from his desk, swinging her legs nervously, suddenly looking much younger than she had during her determined speech minutes earlier. The phone rang 4 times before a hoarse, exhausted voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Parker? This is Margaret Foster calling from Morrison Industries. I'm Mr. Daniel Morrison's secretary." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came through, stronger but filled with confusion. "Morrison Industries? But my interview isn't until... Wait, what time is it?" The sound of rustling came through the phone, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Oh no. Oh no, I missed it. I set an alarm, but I must have slept through it. The medication... I'm so sorry, I can explain." "Ms. Parker," Margaret interrupted gently. "Your daughter is here." The line went completely silent. Daniel could hear Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow, as she processed what Margaret had just said. "My daughter." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Emma is there. At your office." "Yes, ma'am. She arrived at 9 o'clock for your scheduled interview. She said you were ill and couldn't make it, so she came instead." The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. "Oh my God. Emma, is she okay? Is she safe? How did she... She's 7 years old. She can't just... Oh my God." Emma leaned toward the phone, her voice small and apologetic. "Hi, Mom. I'm okay. I'm sorry. Please don't be mad." "Emma Grace Parker," Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "You took the bus alone? Across the city? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? Anything could have happened to you. You could have gotten lost or hurt or... Oh, sweetie, I can't believe you did that." Daniel could hear Sarah crying now, and he felt that uncomfortable sensation in his chest growing stronger. This wasn't the crying of an irresponsible parent whose child had misbehaved. This was the crying of someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long and had just discovered that weight had nearly crushed someone she loved. "Ms. Parker," Daniel found himself speaking, his voice gentler than usual. "Emma is safe. She's in my office, and I assure you she's unharmed. I'm arranging for my driver to bring her home immediately, but we need your address." We're staying with a friend," Sarah said, her voice thick with tears and embarrassment. "It's 2847 Riverside Avenue, apartment 3B. Mrs. Rodriguez. That's where we're staying temporarily." Daniel scribbled down the address, noting the word temporarily and understanding exactly what it meant. They had nowhere permanent to live. Emma's earlier statement about being evicted hadn't been exaggeration or misunderstanding. It had been simple, painful truth. "My driver will have her there within the hour," Daniel said. "And Ms. Parker, when you're recovered, please call my office. I'd like to reschedule your interview." The silence that followed was different from before. Daniel could almost feel Sarah's shock through the phone line. You still want to interview me?" Sarah asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "After my daughter showed up instead of me? After this completely unprofessional disaster? Your daughter showed initiative, courage, and loyalty," Daniel heard himself saying, surprising himself with the words. "Those are traits she learned from somewhere. I'd like to meet the person who taught her those things." More crying, but different now, the sound of hope mixed with relief and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll rest and recover," Daniel replied. "We'll discuss the details when you're well." After Margaret ended the call, Emma looked at Daniel with tears streaming down her face. Is Mom really mad? Your mother is scared, Daniel corrected, pulling a tissue box from his desk drawer and placing it within Emma's reach. She's scared because she loves you and you put yourself in danger. But I think she's also proud of you, even if she shouldn't be. I just wanted to help, Emma said, wiping her eyes. Mom tries to hide it, but I know she cries at night sometimes. I hear her. She thinks I'm asleep, but I'm not always. She's scared all the time now, Mr. Morrison. I thought if I could just explain to you how good she is, maybe you'd give her a chance. Daniel sat back down at his desk, studying this unusual child who had somehow seen past his carefully constructed walls in less than an hour. Tell me more about your mother, Emma. Not the resume version, the real version. Emma brightened slightly, sitting up straighter. Mom is the best mom in the whole world. Even when we don't have much money, she always makes sure I have what I need. When we had to leave our apartment, she packed all my toys first before her own stuff. She said my childhood was more important than her clothes. What happened with your apartment? Daniel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Mom lost her job and we couldn't pay the rent anymore. The landlord was nice at first, but then he said we had to leave. Mom tried to find work, but nobody would hire her. She said she was either too qualified or not qualified enough, and I didn't understand what that meant. But I could tell it hurt her feelings every time someone said no. Daniel knew exactly what that meant. Sarah Parker was in the nightmare zone of job hunting, overqualified for entry-level positions, underqualified for executive roles, and with an employment gap that made hiring managers nervous. It was a vicious cycle that trapped thousands of people, and it had nothing to do with their actual abilities or work ethic. Does your mother have other family? Someone who could help? Daniel asked. Emma shook her head. Mom's parents died when I was little. I don't really remember them, and we don't talk to my dad. Mom says he's not in our lives, and that's for the best. It's just me and Mom. That's why we have to take care of each other. The simple statement, that's why we have to take care of each other, hit Daniel harder than it should have. This child understood responsibility and loyalty in a way that most adults in his life never had. She had risked her own safety because she understood that her mother was drowning and needed help. Margaret knocked on the door and entered. Mr. Morrison, your driver is ready. I've also taken the liberty of packing some lunch for Emma from the executive dining room. I thought she might be hungry. Thank you, Margaret, Daniel said, then looked at Emma. Have you eaten today? Emma's hesitation was answer enough. I had breakfast, she said unconvincingly. Toast. Half a piece of toast. Because that was all the food in the house? Daniel asked bluntly. Emma's silence confirmed his suspicion. He felt anger rising in his chest, not at Emma or Sarah, but at a system that let a hard-working professional and her child go hungry while people like him ate $1,000 meals without thinking twice. Margaret, have the driver stop at Sterling Market on the way to Riverside Avenue. Put it on my account. Have him get groceries. Enough for a week. Include everything. Fresh produce. Proteins, bread, milk, whatever they need. Mr. Morrison, that's very generous, but Margaret began. Just do it, Daniel said firmly. Then, seeing Emma's wide-eyed expression, he added more gently, Your mother is sick. She needs proper nutrition to recover. Consider it an advance on her first paycheck. But she doesn't have the job yet, Emma pointed out with that brutally honest logic that children possessed. No, Daniel agreed. But she will after her interview. I have a feeling about these things. The smile that broke across Emma's face was so full of genuine joy that Daniel had to look away again. He wasn't used to being someone's hero. He was used to being respected, feared, even admired, but not this pure, uncomplicated gratitude. As Margaret led Emma out of the office, the child turned back at the door. Mr. Morrison, thank you for being nice to me. Mom says there aren't enough nice people in the world anymore. I'm glad you're one of them. After they left, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the chair Emma had occupied. The folder she'd brought still sat on his desk. Sarah Parker's resume, reference letters, certificates of completion for various professional development courses she'd taken while unemployed. Daniel opened it and began to read. What he found was impressive. Sarah Parker had graduated from State University with honors in business administration. Her work history at Thornton Financial showed steady advancement, increased responsibilities, glowing performance reviews. Her former supervisor had written a reference letter that praised her organizational skills, her ability to anticipate needs, her grace under pressure. She had taken online courses in project management, advanced Excel, even basic coding, all while unemployed and presumably struggling financially. This was exactly the kind of employee Daniel needed: skilled, motivated, constantly improving. So why hadn't she found work in 8 months? Daniel pulled up his computer and did something he rarely did. He looked at job market statistics. What he found was sobering. For every executive assistant position posted, there were an average of 200 applicants. People with employment gaps were typically eliminated in the first screening. Single parents were often passed over for positions requiring long hours or flexibility. And perhaps most damning, there was an unconscious bias against candidates who were too desperate. The very desperation that Sarah Parker probably couldn't hide in interviews, knowing her daughter was depending on her. Daniel had never thought about these things before. Why would he? His own path to success had been straightforward: elite education, family connections, starting capital from an inheritance. He had worked hard, certainly, but he'd never had to choose between feeding himself and paying rent. He'd never had to explain an employment gap or hide desperation in an interview. His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. Arrived at Riverside Avenue with Miss Emma and groceries. The mother came down to meet us. She asked me to thank you. She was crying. Daniel stared at the message, that uncomfortable feeling in his chest expanding. He told himself he'd done a good deed. Nothing more. He'd helped Sarah Parker get back on her feet professionally, and then their paths would never cross again. This was charity, not personal involvement. But even as he thought this, he knew something had shifted. Emma Parker had walked into his office that morning and cracked something open, some long-sealed part of him that remembered what it felt like to care about someone else's struggle. His next meeting was with his executive team to discuss quarterly profits. As they presented graphs showing increased margins achieved through labor cost optimization, which Daniel now realized was corporate speak for paying people as little as possible, he found himself distracted. He kept thinking about Sarah Parker, unemployed for 8 months, about Emma, eating half a piece of toast for breakfast, about the thousands of people represented by those optimized labor costs, all struggling to survive while his company celebrated record profits. Mr. Morrison, do you agree with the proposed cuts to the benefits package? His CFO, Robert Chen, was looking at him expectantly. No, Daniel heard himself say. The room went silent. Daniel never said no to increased profitability. Sir? Robert asked, confused. No, Daniel repeated more firmly. We're not cutting benefits. In fact, I want a full audit of our compensation structure. I want to see a comparison of our wages to cost of living, our benefits to industry standards, our employee retention rates to competitors. But sir, the cuts would increase our profit margin by— I don't care, Daniel interrupted, surprising himself as much as everyone else in the room. Schedule a follow-up meeting for next week. I want proposals for how we can improve employee compensation without sacrificing quality or competitiveness. Figure it out. After the confused executives filed out, Daniel sat alone in the conference room, wondering what had come over him. One morning with a 7-year-old child, and suddenly he was rethinking his entire corporate philosophy, but he couldn't shake the image of Emma clutching that folder, her small face so serious, explaining how her mother packed Emma's toys before her own clothes. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Parker, crying on the phone, terrified that her daughter had traveled across the city alone because she'd been too sick and too desperate to maintain the facade of having everything under control. His phone rang. It was Margaret. Mr. Morrison, I have Sarah Parker on line 2. She insisted on calling to thank you personally. Daniel hesitated, then picked up. Ms. Parker. Mr. Morrison, Sarah's voice was still hoarse but stronger than before. I don't even know where to begin. The groceries, the ride home for Emma, the rescheduled interview. You didn't have to do any of that. Your daughter is very persuasive, Daniel said, trying to keep his tone professional. My daughter is very lucky she's still alive after the stunt she pulled, Sarah replied. But there was warmth under the exasperation. Mr. Morrison, I know this must have been the strangest interview experience of your career. I want you to know that what Emma did was completely unacceptable, and we're going to have a very serious conversation about safety and boundaries. She loves you very much, Daniel found himself saying. That was obvious from the moment she walked into my office. She's my whole world, Sarah said quietly. Everything I do is for her. That's why I need to be honest with you, even if it costs me this opportunity. Daniel felt apprehension rising. What do you need to be honest about? I'm desperate, Mr. Morrison. I need this job badly. And that desperation might make me not the best judge of what's appropriate or professional. If you're only offering me this interview out of pity or obligation because of what Emma did, please tell me now. I can't afford to hope for something that isn't real. The raw vulnerability in her voice was almost painful to hear. Daniel realized that Sarah Parker had spent 8 months building up walls to protect herself from disappointment, and her daughter's actions had torn those walls down, leaving her exposed. Ms. Parker, Daniel said carefully, I'm not offering you an interview out of pity. I reviewed your credentials while Emma was being driven home. You're qualified for this position, possibly overqualified. What I'm offering is an opportunity for both of us to determine if this would be a good professional fit. Thank you, Sarah whispered. That means more than you know. After they ended the call, Daniel stood at his window again, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there in Riverside, in a friend's apartment, a mother and daughter were unpacking groceries and probably having a difficult conversation about boundaries and safety. Somewhere out there, thousands of other people were fighting battles he'd never had to fight, carrying burdens he'd never had to carry. And for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Morrison felt the weight of his privilege, not as something to defend or deny, but as a responsibility he'd been ignoring for too long. The day had started with him viewing his wealth and power as a sign of his superiority. Now he was beginning to understand it was an accident of birth and circumstance, and what he did with it was the only thing that really mattered. Emma Parker had taught him that lesson in less than an hour. He suspected her mother had many more lessons to teach him, if he was willing to learn. 3 days later, Sarah Parker stood outside the Morrison Industries building, trying to calm her racing heart. She had recovered from the flu, but her anxiety was far worse than any fever had been. She smoothed down her interview outfit, a professional ensemble she'd bought years ago when times were better, now slightly worn, but still presentable. In her hands, she clutched the same leather folder Emma had carried, and the irony wasn't lost on her. You're going to do great, Mom, Emma had whispered that morning before school, hugging her tightly. Mr. Morrison is nice. He seemed scary at first, but he's actually nice. Sarah wasn't sure nice was the word she'd use for a billionaire CEO who had every reason to reject her outright after the disaster her daughter had caused. But Emma's faith was unshakable, and Sarah drew strength from that even as she stepped into the marble lobby that screamed wealth she'd never possess. The security guard checked her identification and directed her to the executive elevators. As she rode up to the 47th floor, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked tired. 8 months of unemployment, stress, and single parenthood had etched lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked older than 31. She looked exactly like what she was, desperate. And desperation, she'd learned, was something employers could smell from a mile away. The elevator doors opened to reveal Margaret Foster waiting with a professional smile. Ms. Parker, welcome. Please follow me. As they walked through the executive suite, Sarah couldn't help but notice everything Emma must have seen. The expensive artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows with impossible views, the quiet hum of wealth and power. This was a different world from the cramped apartment she shared with her daughter in Mrs. Rodriguez's spare room. Mr. Morrison will see you now, Margaret said, opening the heavy office door. Daniel Morrison stood as she entered, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked from what she'd imagined. Emma had described him as tall and serious, but she hadn't mentioned the intelligence in his eyes, or the way he studied Sarah with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely seen. Miss Parker, Daniel extended his hand. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm but not aggressive grip, and sat in the chair her daughter had occupied days earlier. She could almost see Emma's small form perched here, clutching that folder with determined hands. Mr. Morrison, before we begin, I need to apologize, Sarah started, the words she'd rehearsed tumbling out. What my daughter did was completely inappropriate. She put herself in danger, and she put you in an incredibly awkward position. I take full responsibility for not securing proper childcare while I was ill, and for not having better boundaries established with— Ms. Parker, Daniel interrupted gently. Your daughter didn't put me in an awkward position. She gave me one of the most memorable mornings of my career. And while I understand your concerns about safety, I'm more interested in discussing your qualifications than dissecting what Emma did. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in this interview. She had promised herself that much. However, Daniel continued, leaning back in his chair, I do have one question before we proceed with the professional portion of this conversation. Yes? How did you raise a child who loves you enough to risk everything for you? The question caught Sarah completely off guard. She had prepared for questions about her employment gap, her skills, her availability. She hadn't prepared for this. Sarah struggled to find words. I just try to show her every day that she matters, that she's valued, that love isn't something you say, it's something you do. Daniel nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Your daughter told me you packed her toys before your own clothes when you were evicted, that you try to hide when you're scared so she won't worry, that you cry at night when you think she's asleep. Sarah felt heat rising to her cheeks, shame mixed with the vulnerability of having her private struggles exposed. She told you all that? She's very observant and very loyal. Daniel picked up her resume from his desk. Let's talk about your professional experience. You worked at Thornton Financial for 6 years. Excellent references. Why did you leave? Sarah had practiced this answer, but suddenly the rehearsed corporate language felt dishonest. Something about Daniel Morrison's direct gaze demanded truth. The company was acquired by Parker Investments, Sarah said. They kept the upper management and the entry-level staff, but eliminated the middle tier, people like me who had worked up from the bottom but hadn't reached executive level yet. I was told I was too expensive for my position, but not experienced enough for promotion. It was just business, nothing personal. Except it was personal, Daniel observed. You lost your income, your health insurance, your stability. How is that not personal? Sarah blinked, surprised by his perception. I suppose you're right. It felt very personal when I couldn't pay my rent. And yet you used those 8 months to take additional courses to improve your skills. Most people would have been too depressed or overwhelmed to do that. Most people don't have a 7-year-old daughter depending on them, Sarah replied. Emma needed to see that setbacks don't define you, that you keep learning, keep trying, keep moving forward, even when everything seems impossible. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her with that intense gaze. Ms. Parker, I'm going to be direct with you. I've interviewed dozens of candidates for this position. Most had impressive credentials, perfect interview skills, and no visible signs of struggle. But I've realized that those smooth exteriors often hide people who've never had to fight for anything, who don't understand what real pressure feels like. Are you saying my desperation is an asset? Sarah asked, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. I'm saying your resilience is an asset, Daniel corrected. You've been fighting an uphill battle for 8 months, and you're still fighting. You're still studying, still improving yourself, still showing up even when it would be easier to give up. That's not desperation. That's strength. Sarah felt something cracking inside her chest. After 8 months of rejection, of being made to feel like her unemployment was a moral failing rather than an economic circumstance, hearing someone recognize her struggle as strength was almost too much to bear. However, Daniel continued, this position requires more than resilience. It requires someone who can anticipate my needs before I articulate them, who can manage complex schedules and high-pressure situations, who can essentially run my professional life while I focus on strategic decisions. Tell me why you believe you can do that. Sarah took a deep breath, pushing aside her emotions and focusing on what she knew she could deliver. At Thornton Financial, I managed the schedules for 3 senior partners simultaneously. I coordinated board meetings, client presentations, and international conference calls across multiple time zones. I never missed a deadline, never double-booked an appointment, never let anything fall through the cracks. She pulled documents from her folder, the same folder Emma had brought, and slid them across the desk. These are letters from clients I worked with. They're not from my supervisor. Those are already in my resume packet. These are from people I coordinated with directly. They speak to my reliability, my attention to detail, my ability to problem solve under pressure. Daniel picked up the letters, reading through them carefully. Sarah watched his expression, trying to gauge his reaction. When he looked up, there was something new in his eyes. Respect. These are impressive, Daniel said. But I need to ask the difficult question. You have a young daughter and no family support. This position often requires long hours, occasional travel, and immediate availability when crises arise. How will you manage that? It was the question Sarah had been dreading, the one that had cost her opportunities before. Single mothers were seen as liabilities, unable to fully commit to demanding careers. But she'd learned that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was better than promises she couldn't keep. Mr. Morrison, I won't lie to you. Being a single mother is challenging. Emma is my priority, and there will be times when I need to balance her needs with work demands. But I've been doing that balance for 7 years, and I've never let my personal life interfere with my professional responsibilities. Sarah leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. At Thornton Financial, I arranged backup childcare, emergency contacts, and contingency plans for every possible scenario. Emma knew my work schedule better than I did because I prepared her for it. She learned early that my career wasn't in competition with her. It was for her, to give her the life she deserves. And when those plans fail? Daniel asked. When your daughter gets sick at school and you're in the middle of a crucial meeting? Then I'll be honest about the situation, find someone to cover the meeting if possible, or bring Emma here and set her up quietly in a corner while I finish, Sarah answered. I won't pretend challenges don't exist, but I will always find solutions. That's what single mothers do. We solve impossible problems every single day. The silence that followed felt weighted with significance. Sarah couldn't read Daniel's expression, couldn't tell if her honesty had helped or hurt her chances. Finally, Daniel spoke. Your daughter told me something during her visit. She said that people like me decide things for people like you, that it's not always fair, but that's how the world works. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What else had Emma said? She was right, Daniel continued. I do have power that she and you don't have, but I've been thinking about that power differently since Emma walked into my office. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city. I've spent my career believing that wealth and success were measures of worth, that people who struggled were somehow less capable, less intelligent, less deserving. He turned back to face Sarah. Your daughter shattered that belief in less than an hour. She showed me that the only real difference between people like me and people like you is circumstance and opportunity. Not worth, not capability, just luck. Sarah didn't know how to respond. This level of self-reflection from a CEO was unprecedented in her experience. Ms. Parker, I'd like to offer you this position, Daniel said, returning to his desk. But I need to be clear about something. I'm not offering it because I feel sorry for you or because your daughter's visit made me feel guilty. I'm offering it because you're qualified, because you've demonstrated extraordinary resilience, and because I believe you'll excel in this role. Sarah felt the world tilt. After 8 months of rejection, of doors closing in her face, of wondering if she'd ever work again, this was happening. The salary is $90,000 annually, Daniel continued, with full benefits including health insurance, retirement contributions, and 4 weeks paid vacation. I know that's standard for this position, but given your circumstances, I'm also offering a signing bonus of $10,000 to help you secure permanent housing. The numbers didn't seem real. Sarah had been surviving on unemployment benefits that had recently expired, on the charity of Mrs. Rodriguez, on food banks and community resources. $90,000 might as well have been $9 million. Sarah's voice broke. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Daniel replied. Say you'll start next week. Say you'll help me figure out how to be a better CEO, not just for my company, but for all the employees whose stories I've never bothered to learn. Yes, Sarah whispered, then stronger. Yes, thank you. You won't regret this. I'm certain I won't. Daniel stood and extended his hand again. Welcome to Morrison Industries, Ms. Parker. As Sarah shook his hand, she felt tears finally escaping despite her best efforts. These weren't tears of desperation anymore. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope rekindled after months of darkness. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said as she prepared to leave, Emma was right about you. What did she say? She said you seemed scary at first, but you're actually nice. Sarah smiled through her tears. She has good instincts about people. After Sarah left, Daniel sat alone in his office, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. Hiring Sarah Parker wasn't just a business decision. It was a commitment to the transformation that had begun when a 7-year-old child walked through his door. His phone buzzed with a message from his CFO, Robert Chen. Board meeting moved to tomorrow. They've heard about your new social initiatives. Not happy? Prepare for pushback. Daniel stared at the message, realizing that his journey toward becoming a better person wasn't going to be as simple as making one good hire. There would be resistance, challenges, people who benefited from the old system fighting to maintain it. But as he looked at the chair where both Emma and Sarah had sat, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond profit. The real transformation was just beginning. Sarah Parker's first week at Morrison Industries was a masterclass in controlled chaos. She arrived each morning before Daniel, organized his schedule with military precision, and stayed late to ensure every detail was perfect. By the third day, Daniel found himself wondering how he'd ever functioned without her. Your meeting with the advertising team has been moved to Conference Room B, Sarah informed him one morning, appearing at his office door with her tablet. The materials they requested are already set up. I also took the liberty of reviewing their proposal and flagged 3 sections that contradict your stated company values. Notes are in the red folder. Daniel looked up from his computer, impressed. You reviewed a 60-page proposal overnight? Emma had a sleepover at Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter's house, Sarah explained. I had time, and Mr. Morrison, the proposal is excellent overall. Those 3 sections are easily fixable. I just wanted you to have the information before making decisions. This was exactly what Daniel had needed. Someone who didn't just manage his schedule, but actively improved his ability to lead. Sarah Parker was proving to be worth far more than her already generous salary, but not everyone at Morrison Industries shared Daniel's enthusiasm. The board meeting that afternoon was held in the executive conference room on the 48th floor, a space deliberately designed to intimidate with its massive table, leather chairs, and panoramic views. 8 board members sat around the table, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile as Daniel entered. Gentlemen, Daniel greeted them, taking his seat at the head of the table. Thank you for making time for this discussion. Richard Blackwood, the eldest board member and largest shareholder after Daniel, leaned back in his chair with undisguised contempt. Daniel, we're here because you've lost your mind. Raising entry-level wages by 20%? Expanding the benefits package? Hiring a single mother with an 8-month employment gap as your executive assistant? What's next? Turning this into a charity organization. I'm making strategic investments in human capital, Daniel replied calmly, though he felt tension building in his shoulders. Employee retention is up. Productivity has increased. Morale metrics that were previously abysmal are now showing positive trends. At what cost? Demanded Gregory Walsh, the CFO of their largest subsidiary. You've decreased our profit margins by 2.3% in a single quarter. Shareholders are asking questions. Shareholders can ask all the questions they want, Daniel said firmly. I control 51% of this company. These changes are happening. You mean these changes will continue until they destroy everything you've built? Interjected Martin Cruz, whose venture capital firm had helped fund Morrison Industries in its early days. Daniel, I've known you for 15 years. This isn't you. What happened? Did you have some kind of breakdown? Daniel thought about how to answer. He could tell them about Emma Parker walking into his office, about the 7-year-old child who'd shown him the human cost of his business practices. But he knew they wouldn't understand. To them, people like Emma and Sarah were statistics, not human beings with dignity and dreams. What happened, Daniel said carefully, is that I started paying attention. I started seeing the people who work for this company as individuals rather than line items on a budget. And I realized that we've been succeeding financially while failing morally. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Failing morally? Richard's voice dripped with sarcasm. We run a profitable legal business. We provide jobs. We contribute to the economy. What moral failing are you referring to? We pay people wages they can't live on while we celebrate record profits, Daniel said, his voice gaining intensity. We offer benefits packages that don't actually cover their healthcare needs. We treat human beings as disposable resources, and then wonder why we have constant turnover and low productivity. That's called capitalism, Gregory said flatly. That's how business works. No, Daniel corrected. That's how we've chosen to do business. But there are other ways that are both profitable and humane. Humane, Martin repeated, shaking his head. Daniel, listen to yourself. You sound like a progressive politician, not a CEO. This kind of thinking will destroy this company. Before Daniel could respond, there was a soft knock on the conference room door. Sarah entered, her expression apologetic but urgent. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation that requires your attention. Can it wait? Daniel asked, grateful for the interruption, but aware that leaving mid-meeting would weaken his position. I'm afraid not, sir. It concerns your 4 o'clock with Senator Harrison. His office just called. He's arriving 30 minutes early and waiting in your office. Daniel stood, recognizing the diplomatic escape Sarah had just provided him. Whether the senator was actually early or this was a strategic fiction. Gentlemen, we'll continue this discussion later, but let me be clear. These changes are not negotiable. As he left the conference room, he heard Richard's voice carrying through the closing door. Mark my words. This company will be in crisis within 6 months. In the elevator, Daniel turned to Sarah. Is Senator Harrison actually early? Sarah's lips twitched in a small smile. He's exactly on time. But you looked like you needed an extraction. You were listening? The boardroom intercom was accidentally left on, Sarah said innocently. I certainly didn't deliberately monitor the meeting to protect you from an ambush. Daniel found himself almost laughing. Accidentally on purpose? Something like that. Mr. Morrison, those men in that room don't want change. They want to protect their profit margins regardless of human cost. But you're right about what you're doing. Don't let them make you doubt that. The elevator doors opened to the 47th floor. As they walked toward Daniel's office, he asked quietly, How do you deal with it? The people who see you as less than human because of your circumstances. Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him. I remember that their opinions don't define my worth. And I remind myself that the people who matter, like Emma, see me clearly. The rest is just noise. Before Daniel could respond, a familiar small voice called out from his office waiting area. Mom, Mr. Morrison. Emma Parker sat on one of the waiting room chairs, her backpack beside her, a book open on her lap. She jumped down and ran toward them, her face lighting up with that pure, uncomplicated joy that children possessed. Emma? Sarah's voice was sharp with concern. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at after-school care. Mrs. Chen brought me, Emma explained, referring to her teacher. She said there was a family emergency and I needed to go to your work. Is everything okay? Is Grandma Rodriguez sick? Sarah pulled out her phone, confusion evident on her face. I didn't call Mrs. Chen, I didn't… Daniel's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Thought you might like to meet the consequences of your new policies in person. RB. His blood ran cold. Richard Blackwood had somehow arranged for Emma to be pulled from school and brought here. It was a power play, a reminder that he had connections and influence that extended beyond the boardroom. Sarah, Daniel said quietly, take Emma into my office. I need to make a call. After they disappeared through his office door, Daniel called Richard directly. The older man answered on the first ring, his voice smug. Did you enjoy my little surprise? You manipulated a school into releasing a 7-year-old child, Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you understand how illegal that is? How unconscionable? I simply had my assistant call pretending to be Sarah Parker's emergency contact, Richard said casually. Schools are surprisingly easy to fool when you sound authoritative. Consider it a demonstration of how vulnerable your new assistant's situation is. Single mother, precarious childcare, no family support. One phone call and her whole life can be disrupted. If you ever go near that child or her mother again, Daniel said, each word precise and controlled, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you professionally and personally. Am I clear? Threatening a board member? Richard laughed. Daniel, you're more changed than I thought. The old you would have fired Sarah Parker for being a liability. The new you is apparently willing to go to war over her. How touching. The call ended. Daniel stood in his reception area, his hands shaking with rage he hadn't felt in years. Richard had targeted a child to make a point, had deliberately frightened a 7-year-old girl and her mother to prove he could. Inside his office, Daniel found Sarah holding Emma, both of them clearly shaken. Emma's earlier joy had been replaced by confusion and fear. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, her voice tight. "What's going on? Who would do this?" Daniel crouched down so he was at Emma's eye level. "Emma, you're safe now. No one is going to hurt you or your mom. I promise you that." "But why did Mrs. Chen say there was an emergency?" Emma asked, tears in her eyes. "I got scared. I thought something bad happened." "Someone made a mistake," Daniel said carefully, choosing his words for a child's understanding. "A very bad mistake that I'm going to fix. But I need you to be brave for a little while longer, okay?" Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. "Okay, I can be brave. Mom says, Parker, women are always brave." Sarah's eyes met Daniel's over Emma's head, and in them he saw not just fear and confusion, but a question. Was taking this job a mistake? Had she brought her daughter into danger? "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, "I need to tell you something about the men I work with. Some of them are not good people. They don't like the changes I'm making, and they're trying to intimidate me by targeting you and Emma." "Then maybe I should resign," Sarah said immediately. "I won't let my daughter be used as a weapon against you." "No," Daniel said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They want to prove that people like you are too vulnerable, too complicated, too risky to employ. If you leave, they win, and they'll keep winning until no one dares to challenge them." "But Emma will be protected," Daniel interrupted. "I'm arranging security for both of you, and I'm having my legal team contact Emma's school to ensure this never happens again. Richard Blackwood just made the biggest mistake of his career." Emma looked between the two adults, trying to understand the adult world that had suddenly become threatening. "Mr. Morrison, are you and Mom in trouble because of me? Because I came here that day?" "No, sweetheart," Daniel said gently. "You're not the reason for any of this. The reason is that some people don't like when others try to make the world more fair. But you know what? That's exactly why it's important to keep trying. Like Mom says, just because something is hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing," Emma said, repeating what was clearly a family mantra. Exactly like that. Over the next few hours, Daniel set machinery in motion. His legal team filed complaints with Emma's school and threatened litigation if their security protocols were so easily bypassed. He hired a private security firm to provide protection for Sarah and Emma, discreet but effective. And he called an emergency board meeting for the following day. "You're going to war with Richard Blackwood," Sarah observed as she helped organize the flurry of documents and communications that resulted from Daniel's decisions. "He's powerful. He has allies." "So do I," Daniel replied. "And I have something he doesn't, I'm right. That doesn't always win, but it's a start." That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave with Emma, she paused at Daniel's office door. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask, why are you doing this? Really? It would be so much easier for you to just let me go, to go back to how things were." Daniel considered the question, the same one he'd been asking himself since Emma Parker first walked into his office. "A few weeks ago, I thought success meant profit margins and shareholder value. Then a 7-year-old child showed me what real success looks like. A mother who sacrifices everything for her daughter. A daughter who risks everything for her mother. People who love each other so much they make the impossible possible." He looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep on the office couch, exhausted from the day's stress. "I'm doing this because I want to live in a world where people like you and Emma don't have to fight so hard just to survive. And I have the power to help create that world." "What kind of person would I be if I didn't use that power?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, Daniel Morrison. Emma was right about you." "I'm trying to be," Daniel replied. "Your daughter is a surprisingly good judge of character." As they left, Daniel returned to his desk and began preparing for the next day's board meeting. Richard Blackwood had drawn a line in the sand. Tomorrow, Daniel would cross it. The war for the soul of Morrison Industries had officially begun. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 in the morning, but Daniel arrived at 6. He wanted time to think, to prepare, to steel himself for what he knew would be the defining moment of his career. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Sarah arrived at 7, despite his instructions to take the day off with Emma. She entered his office carrying 2 coffees and that leather folder that had become a symbol of everything that had changed in his life. "You should be with Emma," Daniel said without preamble. "Emma is with Mrs. Rodriguez and the security team you hired," Sarah replied, setting 1 coffee on his desk. "And I should be here doing my job. Whatever happens in that boardroom today affects both of us. Sarah, if this goes badly, then we'll deal with it," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Together. That's what partnership means, Mr. Morrison. You stood up for me and Emma. Now I stand with you." Daniel felt something warm expanding in his chest. Gratitude mixed with an emotion he couldn't quite name. For so many years, his relationships had been transactional. People stayed close because he had power, money, connections. Sarah Parker stayed close because she believed in what they were trying to do. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said, gesturing for her to sit. "Something I've never told anyone." Sarah sat, her expression open and patient. "When I was young, maybe 10 years old, my father lost his job," Daniel began, the words coming slowly, painfully. He was a middle manager at a manufacturing company. They downsized, and he was let go without ceremony or severance. I watched him send out hundreds of resumes. I watched him take jobs below his qualification just to keep food on the table. I watched the humiliation break him piece by piece. Sarah's hand moved to her chest, understanding flickering in her eyes. He started drinking. Then he left. Just walked out one day and never came back. My mother told me it was because he couldn't handle failure, couldn't handle being less than what he thought a man should be. Daniel's voice was flat, controlled. I promised myself I would never be vulnerable like that. Never let anyone have power over my survival. So I built walls. I built an empire. And I became exactly like the people who destroyed my father. Until Emma walked into your office, Sarah said softly. Until Emma walked into my office, Daniel agreed. And I saw myself in Richard Blackwood's eyes. I saw the casual cruelty, the willingness to destroy people's lives for profit. And I realized I had become the villain of someone else's story. Before Sarah could respond, Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, the board members are arriving. They're requesting you join them in the conference room." Daniel stood, straightening his tie with hands that wanted to shake but wouldn't. "Whatever happens in there, Sarah, I want you to know that hiring you was the best decision I've made in years. Then let's go make sure it wasn't the last good decision you get to make," Sarah replied with a small smile. The conference room was already full when Daniel entered, but the atmosphere was different from the previous meeting. Richard Blackwood sat at the far end of the table, flanked by Gregory Walsh and Martin Cruz. But there were others present too, board members who usually remained neutral, and surprisingly, several department heads who normally wouldn't attend board meetings. "Quite the crowd," Daniel observed, taking his seat. Sarah stood by the door, tablet ready, her presence a quiet statement of solidarity. "We thought this discussion required witnesses," Richard said, his voice carrying that same smugness from their phone call. "Daniel, we've called this meeting to discuss a vote of no confidence in your leadership." The words hung in the air like a blade. A vote of no confidence would strip Daniel of his operational authority, even if he retained majority ownership. It would effectively end his ability to make changes. "On what grounds?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady. "On the grounds that you've lost sight of this company's mission," Gregory spoke up, sliding a document across the table. "Your recent policy changes have cost us millions. Productivity is down in several departments. And most concerning, you've allowed personal feelings to compromise your judgment." "Personal feelings?" Daniel repeated. "Your executive assistant," Martin said, gesturing toward Sarah. "A woman you hired not because she was the best candidate, but because her daughter manipulated you emotionally. You've let sympathy cloud your business judgment." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Daniel saw her hands tighten on her tablet. He felt rage building but forced it down. Losing his temper would only prove their point. "Sarah Parker was hired because she is exceptionally qualified," Daniel said evenly. "Her credentials speak for themselves. And the fact that her daughter's stunt tugged at your heartstrings had nothing to do with it." Richard's smile was cruel. "Daniel, we all saw the security footage. A little girl walks in with big sad eyes and a sob story. And suddenly, you're Mother Teresa. It's pathetic." "What's pathetic?" A new voice spoke from the doorway. is 8 grown men ganging up on a single mother and pretending it's about business. Everyone turned to see Margaret Foster standing in the entrance, her expression fierce. Behind her stood several other employees, department heads, longtime staff members, people Daniel had worked with for years. "Margaret?" Daniel said, confused. "Mr. Morrison, these people wanted witnesses," Margaret said, walking into the room. "So I brought witnesses, real ones, people who've actually seen the impact of your changes." She was followed by Jennifer Kim, head of human resources. "Mr. Morrison, since you implemented the new wage structure, our turnover rate has dropped by 40%. Exit interviews that used to cite financial stress as a reason for leaving have virtually disappeared. And productivity isn't down," added Marcus Thompson, operations director. "Initial adjustment periods showed a dip, but current metrics show we're 12% more efficient than last quarter. Employees who aren't worried about feeding their families actually work better." "Who knew?" Richard stood abruptly. "This is irregular. These people weren't invited to this meeting. Neither was the vote of no confidence put on the official agenda," Margaret countered. "I checked. This meeting was supposed to be about quarterly projections. You ambushed Mr. Morrison. We're simply leveling the playing field." Daniel felt something shifting in the room. Allegiances being declared, lines being drawn. But before anyone could speak further, his phone buzzed with a message that made his blood freeze. It was a photo of Emma at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment building, with text underneath, "Your security team is good, but not good enough. Last warning. Back down, or the kid learns what real consequences feel like. RB." Daniel's vision went red. He stood slowly, holding up his phone so everyone in the room could see the screen. "You threatened a 7-year-old child," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "You had her removed from school yesterday, and now you're sending me photos of her location with veiled threats. All because I gave her mother a job and raised employee wages." The room erupted. Several board members began speaking at once, their faces shocked. Margaret looked horrified. Sarah went pale, immediately pulling out her own phone to call the security team. But Richard just smiled. "I didn't send that message, Daniel. You have no proof." "I have all the proof I need," Daniel interrupted. "Your phone number, the fact that you're the only person in this company with motive and means. And the fact that you're not even denying it with any real conviction." "It's your word against mine," Richard said, but his confidence was wavering. "Actually, it's not," said a voice from the doorway. A woman in a police uniform entered, badge clearly visible. Detective Lisa Morrison, no relation to Daniel, walked into the conference room with the authority of law behind her. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Detective Morrison from the Cybercrimes Division. We've been monitoring your communications for the past 18 hours, ever since Mr. Daniel Morrison filed a complaint about the school incident. Your assistant's phone records show the call to Emma Parker's school. Your personal phone shows this threatening message sent 2 minutes ago. And we have evidence of at least 3 other incidents of harassment." Richard's face went from smug to ashen. "You can't prove—" "We can prove all of it," the detective interrupted. "And threatening a minor is a crime, Mr. Blackwood. So is making false emergency calls to schools. You'll need to come with me." As 2 officers entered to escort Richard out, the room descended into chaos. Board members were shouting questions. Department heads were calling their teams. Gregory Walsh and Martin Cruz were frantically distancing themselves from Richard's actions. Through it all, Daniel moved to Sarah's side. "Is Emma okay?" "Security confirms she's safe," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "She's fine. She's watching cartoons with Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter. She doesn't even know anything happened." Daniel felt something releasing in his chest. Tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good. That's good." "Mr. Morrison," Margaret approached, her expression somber. "The board is requesting a continuation of this meeting, but without Richard present, the dynamics have shifted significantly." Daniel looked around the room at the remaining board members. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked genuinely shocked by Richard's behavior. A few looked calculating, already trying to figure out how to use this situation to their advantage. "Gentlemen," Daniel addressed them, his voice carrying authority earned through the morning's revelations. "Let me be very clear. The changes I've implemented are not negotiable. Morrison Industries will be a company that treats its employees as human beings, not disposable resources. If any of you cannot support that vision, I'll buy out your shares at market value. but I will not compromise on this. Mr. Morrison, one of the quieter board members, Elizabeth Chen, spoke up. I don't think you'll need to buy anyone out. What Richard did was unconscionable. It's made many of us realize that our resistance to your changes was rooted in the same callousness he displayed. We just hid it better. Another board member, Thomas Wright, nodded slowly. I've been thinking about what you said in our last meeting, about seeing employees as individuals. My daughter just graduated college. She's struggling to find work, sending out hundreds of resumes to places that treat her like a number. And I realized I've been doing the same thing to other people's daughters, other people's children. One by one, the board members who had been neutral or hostile began to speak. Some shared stories of family members struggling in the job market. Others admitted they'd been uncomfortable with the company's practices, but had stayed silent. A few apologized directly to Sarah, acknowledging that their treatment of her hiring had been rooted in prejudice rather than professional assessment. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel had not only kept his authority, he'd gained genuine support for the first time since starting his transformation. As the room cleared, Sarah approached him, tears streaming down her face. You risked everything. Your company, your reputation, your relationships with these people. For me and Emma. Not just for you and Emma, Daniel corrected gently. For the thousands of employees at this company who deserve better. For my father, who died broken because people like the old me didn't care about collateral damage. For the person I want to become. And who is that person? Sarah asked. Daniel thought about the question, one he'd been asking himself since Emma Parker first walked into his office. Someone Emma can be proud to know when she's older. Someone who uses power to protect rather than exploit. Someone who finally understands what my father couldn't see, that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the beginning of real strength. Sarah hugged him then, a gesture of gratitude and friendship that crossed every professional boundary. Daniel hugged her back, realizing that this connection, compassion, caring about someone else's well-being was worth more than every dollar in his considerable fortune. We should go see Emma, Daniel said when they separated. She deserves to know that she's safe, that the bad man is gone, and that the world she helped create is going to be okay. The world she helped create? Sarah repeated. Your daughter walked into my office and changed everything, Daniel said simply. She saw past my wealth and power to the person underneath. She believed I could be better, and she was right. As they left Morrison Industries that afternoon, walking past employees who smiled and thanked them, past the marble and glass that no longer felt like a fortress, but like a place where good work was done, Daniel realized something profound. He had spent his entire adult life building walls to protect himself from the vulnerability that destroyed his father. It had taken a 7-year-old child to show him that the walls themselves were the real prison, and breaking free, though terrifying, was the only way to truly live.